a week back I uploaded 10 of the very best film-to-game tie-ins, which comprised of a variety of different platforms from the Sega CD up to the Super Nintendo. It was all there pretty much. I was going to make a part 2 in the same format, but I thought, you know what, let's skip home computers and consoles and get straight to the best versions, as well as film-to-game tie-ins which to date still remain arcade exclusives after 20 plus years, and trust me, some of these arcade exclusives will make you wonder why they were never ported. It baffles many people to date with some of these games, it truly does. So today we are checking out 10 arcade games which were tied in with some of the biggest films of the 1980s as well as 1990s. There is one particular game here that, although the film was a mess and to date has a lot of criticism, the arcade game actually wasn't as bad as you might think. Well, certainly not the arcade version of it anyway. There are other games here where you would question if it was even like the film itself. In many cases, of course not, but any sign of action in a film, then of course it would become a game. Why? Because that was business and most children didn't mind spending mum and dad's money on shooting down aliens after all. We are going through several different genres of game in this video, from light gun rail shooters to beat 'em ups and shoot 'em ups, and of course have a little chat around each film the game is actually based on. Anyways, let's check out 10 of the very best arcade film to game tie-ins. I'll be honest with you, as much as I love old school Rambo films, I was never too keen with Rambo 3. My all-time favourite from the original trilogy easily goes to First Blood Part 2, which also had some memorable film game tie-ins that many people have fond memories of. So why did I choose a Rambo 3 game? Well, there were several different games for Rambo 3. My first Rambo game was actually Rambo 3 for the Commodore 64, which was great but fairly difficult. There was also Rambo 3 for the Sega Mega Drive, which was a mediocre game, and another one for the Sega Master System, which was also very different. But I think as far as arcade classics go, Rambo 3 the arcade game is very much underrated. If you have never seen this game before, it looks similar to games like Cable, only this game scrolls too, almost a hybrid of Operation Wolfen. So of course we have plenty of action in this game, in fact an obsessive amount of action in the game, even for a Stallone film game tie-in. The game loosely follows the plot of the film, but bear in mind this is an arcade game, and the idea is to take your money quickly and on to the next customer. So in-depth context of the film itself is kept to a very minimum, and we are presented to a couple of images from the film as well as the very basics of its plot. For those of you who have never watched Rambo 3, well, in a nutshell, Rambo needs to rescue his longtime friend and mentor, Colonel Sam Troutman, who had been captured by the Soviets. The theme and background set in Rambo 3 is a fictional Afghan-Soviet war, so John Rambo was happily content living amongst Thai Buddhists until the news is delivered to him. Before you know it, Rambo is at war fighting to rescue his friends. The game starts off as a side-scrolling and to some extent rail shooter. We can shoot at soldiers and blow up tanks. We are supplied to weapon crates when enemies drop them after we shoot them. We also take on bosses such as tanks and helicopters. Come level 2, we are then presented with a new type of stage where Rambo is running in the desert and shooting at oncoming enemies and tanks. It looks fairly nice for its release date of 1989. For some reason, this particular version was never actually ported to anything, so it's considered to be stuck in the arcade to date. Now, although RoboCop 2 the arcade game includes baddies and bosses, which are fairly random compared with the film, in other words, just randomly chucked in sprites just to make a game, this East Japanese arcade game, which released in 1991, isn't bad at all. If you have ever played any of the other RoboCop 2 games on either home computer or console, these were all very much fairly questionable games. The 8-bit computer versions were fairly bad. The Commodore 64 game in particular was pretty atrocious. was. And the Amiga and Atari ST versions, although a slight upgrade from the 8-bit games, by no means were any of these perfect. It also had a Nintendo Entertainment System game too, which wasn't fantastic. So as for the film itself, of course not a patch on the original 1980s masterpiece, but certainly miles better than the shocker which was a RoboCop 3. Let's be fair, if you're a RoboCop freak like myself, there is absolutely no denying that RoboCop's armor looks ridiculously metallic blue in this film. And yes, it is a little goofy too with a kid playing a villain in the film, but it's okay nevertheless. As for RoboCop 2, the arcade game, then it's a nice little scrolling running gun game where we can fire in both directions and even jump, which is strange as I never recall RoboCop jumping, but I could be wrong, and given it's a game then sure, let's give RoboCop the ability to jump. We travel to New Mission, which gives it the Batman Returns Mega CD look. I highly recommend this game, and let's not forget the original arcade game of RoboCop 2. That game was just phenomenal. Alien 3 wasn't the best of the original Alien trilogy due to script changes and bad looking puppets mixed with fairly questionable CGI. The film takes on immediately from aliens and crash lands Ripley's escape pod onto a penal colony with an alien organism on board with her. Although Alien 3 underperformed in its day compared with the previous two films, it did do fairly well over the years and it's gained its own cult following who gives it a little more appreciation nowadays. Alien 3 obviously had film-to-game tie-ins, largely all the same in gameplay, some better versions than others. The Sega Mega Drive version was probably my favourite back in the day. Now, sadly, this amazing light gun rail shooter known as Alien 3 The Gun never actually made it outside of the arcade, and it's truly baffling in hindsight. It's probably one of the best rail shooters around, and this could easily been ported to the PlayStation or Sega Saturn or even both. So, is it similar to the film? Well, no, it really isn't. My disinterest in Alien 3, the film that is the lack of action. Alien 3, The Gun on the other hand, is a different kettle of fish. It's more like playing Aliens rail shooter game rather than Alien 3. The amount of facehuggers and xenomorphs here are a tad bit overboard, and I don't even recall Ripley outside of the colony shooting down hordes of xenomorphs either. I don't remember rusty looking robots attacking Ripley either, come to think of it. But it is a film-to-game tie-in nevertheless. Whether or not it's like the film, this is a superb game that released in 1993 by Sega, around a year after the film released. There are many amazing games which never got ported to home consoles or home computers like this one, and it truly baffles many people. I would imagine it was some kind of licensing legality issues between Hollywood and Sega, but I'm not sure that anybody really knows for sure. I think Hook, the arcade game, is just proof that if anything was popular enough in the 80s and even 90s, then guaranteed somebody would obtain a license and produce a game for it. Hook had many different versions on multiple platforms, but this particular game stayed in the arcade. This beat-em-up was produced by IREM and released in 1992, where home computers and consoles had mainly 2D platforming games, and some went for the Monkey Island style with Hook on the Amiga. This arcade game was literally on its own, and it's a real shame. We get to control 4 of the main characters from the film and walk through levels punching and kicking things in the environment in order to aid us to defeat the baddies. As for the film itself, this was a big deal in its day, but admittedly not one of my personal favourites. The arcade game though is actually pretty damn good. Now whoever thought that Peter Pan could seriously kick ass with his friends? If you're at the age to remember the launch of Jurassic Park, you will remember the major hype around it at the time of its release back in 1993. This film was probably one of the biggest and most talked about in the early 1990s due to its first of a kind mega impressive CGI, which still holds up fairly well to date. Jurassic Park had many different versions for different platforms, from the top-down and pseudo 3D hybrid game for the Super Nintendo, the platforming game for the Sega Mega Drive, and a totally different game for the 3DO. This rail shooter for the arcade was absolutely superb. It's another one of those cases of never being ported to console or computer at the time, where this wouldn't have looked at a place on either the PlayStation or Sega Saturn, or even both. Sega released this epic shooter in 1994. It went on to subsequently produce arcade sequels for The Lost World, as well as Jurassic Park 3. As for this game itself, it's highly likely handled better with 2 players rather than just one. Jurassic Park will constantly bombard you with dinosaurs left, right and centre. The environments and gameplay world in this game were super impressive for a game of this era. Jurassic Park the Arcades game was the first game in this genre to include 3D environments too. It was also produced using the Sega System 32 board, which was Sega's last board in its Super Scaler series. The early 90s was notorious for taking games and turning them into films. Most of all was either trashed at the time or trashed by critics later on in life. It started with the Super Mario Bros. Film, which I personally think is a decent film, given the limited lore of Super Mario Bros. To work with at that point. We also had a Double Dragon film, which I rented on release, super cheesy but a fun film nevertheless. Then we had Street Fighter the movie. Now, if you ever wanted to see Kylie Minogue in a Cammy outfit, then this was your golden opportunity. Street Fighter the movie was a very hyped up film in its day when it released back in 95. There was toys based on it too, which I'm fairly sure I had a couple of, although at this point I was in that awkward transition of being a kid and moving on to my teenage years. Most famously, this arcades game based on the film used digitized images, and of course certain developers and companies would use this at this time, as the thought of this look was the future of gaming. Sadly, it wasn't. A great idea for the time though, to give games a little more realism. Now, just like the film itself, this arcades game, which actually got ported to PlayStation and Sega Saturn, received a fair amount of bad press at the time, and I am sure it's one of those games that Capcom would likely want to forget about releasing in 1995. But really, was it that bad? I actually like to go against reused reviews, and I'm actually going to say that this beat 'em up isn't bad at all. It's certainly not the worst of its kind to use digital photography to create this look. It's actually a decent beat 'em up. Okay, so nowhere near on par with Street Fighter 2, but yeah, if you have never played this one, give it a go. I'll even give you a hint. Playing Kyle or M. Bison are 2 of the best characters to play as in this game. Yes, I have already showcased Alien 3, but this is Aliens, the second film in the trilogy at this point, and besides this 1990 Konami game, it was widely known to be one of Konami's best games in the run and gun genre, and yes, I would concur. Aliens is pretty damn fun to play. We get to play as either Ripley or Corporal Hicks, starting the game with a fairly basic smart gun, although as we play through the game, we can pick up new weapons which range from grenade launchers as well as flamethrowers. Interestingly, this game changes perspectives. For example, we go from playing a typical looking running gun side-scrolling game and then onto a third-person rail shooter, which is just as nicely designed as the main body of the game itself. Strangely enough, when this game released in 1990, Aliens as in the film was actually 4 years old at this point. Most of these film to game tie-ins were generally put out within the same time as the release of the film itself. But regardless of years, this game is a good one for sure. It loosely follows the plot of Aliens, and we do get some brief narrative, but again, this is an arcades game, and so there isn't really a heavy emphasis on storyline as such. Konami also released another famous arcade game in this same year of 1990, which was of course Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Aliens was actually Konami's second best-selling arcade game of the same year. Although I don't personally remember Aliens being in the arcade, I certainly played Turtles religiously back then in the arcade. Sadly, like many other games in this video, this arcade game never got ported to anything, although many 8-bit home computers had a game known as Aliens the computer game, although not the same as the arcade game by any means. The Commodore 64's American version of Aliens was also very good and well worth checking out the American version of that. Very likely one of the most underrated games in this video. This is Willow. It's based on the high fantasy cult classic from 1988 by Ron Howard, with a fairly young Warwick Davis, who was previously known for his early work in Star Wars and also David Bower's Labyrinth too. We also have a fairly young Val Kilmer too in this film, prior to his role as Jim Morrison, as well as being Batman a little later on. So why is this game underrated? Well, it's very simple. Nobody talks about it with old school memorable arcade games. It's of course considered as a run and gun platforming game, but I mean this one is just so much fun. We start as playing as Willow, shooting down enemies in the game, jumping up and down platforms whilst taking in the beautiful looking pixelated scenery. We can use shops to buy upgrades and health too, which is always a bonus, and we get to take down bosses which are inspired from the film. We can later in the game play as different characters from the film, such as Val Kilmer's character, and use a sword here to bash through the enemies. Willow, the game released by Capcom in 1989, they also released a version for the Nintendo Entertainment System, although that was a very different game and was considered as an RPG. If you have not played Willow, I seriously urge you to, especially if you're a complete sucker for colourful platforming games like myself. This game isn't the most lengthiest game around, it only comprises of just 6 stages, but playing this with 2 very awesome characters makes up for this entirely. James Cameron gave us some of the best films in the 90s and seemed very fond in particular of having Arnold Schwarzenegger in his action films. True Lies was also an amazing Cameron film, which also starred Jamie Lee Curtis in that unforgettable exotic dance scene. But as far as Cameron in arcade games went, we got the phenomenal Terminator 2 Judgment Day, or simply just known as T2, one of the best light gun rail shooters of the early 90s without a doubt. Midway managed to grab the license for what was going to be one of the 90s biggest films ever, and I am sure Midway never regretted doing this. This rail shooter was so popular that much later on, Arcade 1-Up produced a smaller scale replica cabinet, which was actually released in 2021. Terminator 2 games were a little all over the place though in general. The arcade game had various ports which I actually covered in my arcade port series some time back, but Terminator 2 had different games released. For example, one of the first games for the Super Nintendo that I played in the early 90s was Terminator 2 Judgment Day by LJN. Now, although many people criticise that game, I thought it wasn't too bad. The Nintendo Entertainment System also had a completely different version too. As for the Commodore 64, again a completely different game altogether, and that's not even to mention the original Game Boy's version of Terminator 2. So, as for this arcade game, it is again loosely based around the film in which we are protecting John Connor, leader of the human resistance, as well as his mum Sarah Connor from the T-1000. The game is a tough one and likely snatched plenty of your coins back in the day. We play as a T-800 cyborg and can play 2 players simultaneously. There are 7 stages in this game, 4 of which are set in the future of 2029 and features one particular stage which is pure hell hell for many, protecting John Connor as he drives through the wastelands of the future. I am telling you, this stage was pure hell. The remaining stages are set in the present day, which at the time was of course the 90s. John Connor's childhood, that is. Shooting down endoskeletons and everything else in this game is just pure fun. It even has some really awesome sound samples from the film itself.
Terminated. Let's go.
Luke, trust me.
Really, it would have been rude not to include what is considered as one of the greatest arcade games ever released. This is the original 1983 Atari Star Wars game. This game is so great that it even released in the same year that I was born. If you are unfamiliar with the style of this game, you will see what is known as 3D color vector graphics. Those bright green lines and lines of other colors which this game uses were nothing short of wizardry for a 1983 release, and it has a unique look that I still think looks really nice today. Those coloured lines truly pop out on OLED screens today in particular. There are 3 main sequences for each difficulty level in this game, which of course get more difficult as you go through the game. We begin the game by shooting down TIE fighters in space, we then proceed towards the Death Star and fly through its surface, and then we go on to the final trench run. If all this wasn't enough to blow your mind in 1983, then the voice and music in this 1983 game will definitely blow you away without a doubt. Of course, this game had a ridiculous amount of home computer and console ports during the 1980s, ranging from the BBC Micro, Commodore 64, and even the Atari 2600. But really, the true experience of this epic arcades game is the original without a doubt. And that's it for taking a look at all the best arcade film to game tie-ins today. If you've not seen part 1 of this video, then I'm going to link that in the comments section so you can watch that. And again, as always, comment in the comment section and let us know which one of these you like the most. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.
R2 trying to increase the power.
Stay in attack formation.